source as the test question. So knock this out. 6 minutes starting now. All right, folks. So hopefully that was enough time to knock out those 4 questions. I love those warm-ups. They're really preparing you all for the exams. I think we will see some of the impact of that preparation as soon as Wednesday, which is when we will take our next unit exam. That will be on Unit 3. But of course, all of our exams are cumulative, so you can expect to see information from Units 1 and 2 on Wednesday's exam as well. Today is Monday, February 8th, 2021. And as you all know, on Mondays, I like to begin class with a brief message of positivity. Because we're also in the midst of Black History Month, I wanted to begin today's class with a message of positivity based in historical fact. And this history is of a man named Whitney Moore Young. Does anybody know anything about Whitney Young already? Janelle, you clearly know some things. So yeah, Michelle Obama went to a high school named after Whitney Young, and so did I. I went to that same high school. It's on the near west side of Chicago. And so when I was in high school and I was taking classes just like you all are taking classes now, I never really knew much about Whitney Young. Our teachers, I don't remember them ever really talking about this history, even though the school was named after him. The most I can remember knowing about him is what he looked like, and that was because there was a bronze bust of him at the main entrance of the school. So every day I would walk past that, and I got to know what he looked like, but the bust, if I remember correctly, really didn't say much besides the fact that he was a civil rights leader. So it wasn't until college when I took a class on the civil rights movement that I learned much more about him and actually now consider him to be one of my personal heroes for various reasons. But we're going to watch a couple of videos that should total no more than 4 minutes in length. But I want you guys to start to think about these videos, pick up on some things, and be ready to share out what you've learned.
You don't get Black power by chanting it. You get it by doing what the other groups have done. The Irish kept quiet. They didn't shout Irish power or Jew power or Italian power. They kept their mouths shut and took over the police department of New York City.
It was the 60s. While angry youths took to the streets, Whitney Young was in boardrooms convincing corporate giants to hire Black people.
He was able to talk to white people, particularly well-to-do white people, business people, who may have had an interest in settling racial problems but couldn't see it themselves until Whitney Young came along and explained it to them and said, listen, you have a stake in this too.
In just 1 year, he placed 40,000 African Americans in jobs.
Whitney understood power, and he understood politics.
Whitney Young had the ear of the most powerful people in government.
Where would we be today without Medicare or Head Start? The whole panoply of educational programs established. So many of these ideas came from Whitney Young, who pushed aggressively.
He knew how to accomplish what other people were merely for.
But Whitney Young also made enemies.
A handful of those who advocate Black power stood by the door and chanted, "Uncle Tom, Uncle Tom,"
and feared for his life.
Pre-dawn raid to head off an alleged plot to murder moderate civil rights leader Whitney Young.
I think that Whitney Young was a prophet. Few people understood how brilliant his vision for racial transformation of American power was.
You don't get Black power by chanting it.
The day has come to convince white people that working in an all-white business, that kind of bland, sterile, antiseptic environment was cultural suicide.
In 1961, a brash 39-year-old social worker named Whitney Young Jr. set out to break the color barrier in corporate America.
There was no roadmap to corporate America. There was a roadmap to becoming a barber. There was a roadmap to becoming a rail car porter. There was a roadmap to being a postman. You know, you took jobs, mostly blue collar, mostly menial jobs. For a lot of people, their visions, their aspirations were confined by segregation.
Whitney Young, who I thought was cool, articulate, smooth, handsome, my man. I even liked the way he combed his hair. It was obvious the way he dressed, the way he talked, that his focus was different. His focus for the black community was more with corporate America, more on an economic-based revolution.
All we're asking is that the same conscious, deliberate effort which was used for years to exclude Negroes now be used to include Negroes in the mainstream of American life.
If you think about a struggle between black and white people, if you can't talk to the white people, nothing's going to happen. And he was able to talk to white people, particularly well-to-do white people, business people, who may have had an interest in settling racial problems, but couldn't see it themselves until Whitney Young came along and explained it to them and said, listen, you have a stake in this too.
Young's talent for enlisting conservative white businessmen in the cause of integration began in 1947 when he took an industrial relations job at an affiliate of the National Urban League, an organization founded a half-century earlier to help black migrants find jobs and housing in the North.
Okay. So does anybody want to share out anything that they learned or anything that was just curious in that video?
What was curious for me is every time when anytime like somebody want to help people of color, they always could get enemies behind they trying to get behind their back and bring them down.
I love that, Lisa. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. And I really appreciate it because you said anytime someone wants to help people of color, it doesn't matter if they're trying to help them one way or another. It doesn't matter if they're doing it by protesting. It doesn't matter if they're doing it by trying to have conversations or trying to legislate, create new policies, donate. Just regardless of the method, anytime, it always leads to them having enemies. So thanks for pointing that out. Anybody else want to share something that kind of caught their attention? No, nothing else. Okay, well, the reason I share these videos with you all is not only because I went to that same high school, pretty famous high school in Chicago, one of the better high schools in Chicago. I was blessed to be able to attend, and it was named after Whitney Young. But I share that with you all because in his story, I really am reminded of the power we all have to play a role in any social movement. And it doesn't just have to be older people. It doesn't just have to be business professionals. It doesn't just have to be people who are willing to be arrested or willing to protest. It doesn't just have to be the people who speak the loudest. It doesn't just have to be the people who know the most. In his story, I'm reminded of the fact that we all have a contribution to make. In the civil rights movement, I think so often we associate it with people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, but then we're overlooking so many other people. We're overlooking students like the Greensboro Four or the A&T Four, who were only 19 and 20 years old when they staged a sit-in Greensboro. We're overlooking like students like Diane Nash, who led sit-in movements and protests as a student at Fisk University in Nashville. We're overlooking people like Stokely Carmichael, who also became a leader of the student nonviolent coordinating committee, but then eventually became the first person to really champion the phrase Black Power. We're overlooking people like Bayard Rustin, who was a gay Black man who was really a mentor to Martin Luther King and taught him many of Gandhi's ideas about nonviolence. We're overlooking people like Pauli Murray, who was who probably would have been considered in 2021 a transgender person, but at the time, of course, those phrases didn't really exist, and even Pauli Murray didn't necessarily have the language to discuss what her gender or sexual identity was. But at the time, she was considered one of the top lawyers, one of the top Black lawyers, and also a really, really brilliant religious scholar in the 60s as well. So all of these different stories represent just how wide-ranging the civil rights movement was. And Whitney Young's story reminds me of that too, because he was not that guy who was going to be out in the streets protesting. He was not that guy who wanted to be arrested. He was the person who was making the connections with, President Lyndon Johnson and President Richard Nixon. He had the connections with Henry Ford of the Ford Corporation in Detroit. He had the connections with, he played an integral role in bringing Coca-Cola to Atlanta, which totally transformed the economic situation of the city of Atlanta and got Coca-Cola to hire thousands of Black people. So just like you need people on the streets, you need people who are going to raise people's awareness and shed light on injustices. You also need people who are going to be coming at it from other angles. You need students who are going to commit themselves to a lifetime of becoming lawyers and doctors on behalf of the movement. You need business people who are going to be able to donate money to the movement. You need people like Whitney Young who are going to convince these people who are currently in power that it's in their best interest not only to sell their products to Black people, but also to hire Black people. So I love that story. It's one that is too often overlooked. Even I overlooked it as someone who attended a school that was named after him. But it's an important story, and I think it's one that reminds us that, we've got to have people in a position to fight for us to have a seat at the table. And I share that with you guys on this Monday morning as my message of positivity, because I want to remind you that even though you're young, you're just starting off as, some of you probably would disagree with this, but really you are just starting off as students, because the process of learning is lifelong. It doesn't end when you're no longer in school. So you're just starting off as students and as learners, but it doesn't necessarily disqualify you from playing a role. If you see something happening in school or at home or in your communities or in the world that you don't like, then you have the real power to work to change it, to work to fix it. And that comes off as a bit euphemistic or as a bit naive, but I really fully believe in that. I believe in your powers to make change. And we need people who are going to be athletes and use their platform to connect with sports fans who might not otherwise care. We need people who are going to be artists and capture the feelings and the emotions and the pain of these experiences in their artwork, whether it be visual art, musical art, or whatever. We need video game designers who can start to bring some diversity into that field and say, hey, wait a minute, we don't always need to have white characters who sound like this and whose origin stories are like this. So we need everybody who's coming at this from different angles in order for us to really achieve what we're hoping to achieve. And you all have a role to play in that. Don't ever forget it. And don't be discouraged by the things that might point you in a different direction as you go through life. Just stay the course, stay positive, work hard. And I do really believe that you all have the potential to change things for the better. All right. 1 second, please.
You don't get Black Power, but...
All right. So today is again February 8th, 2021. The title of today's lesson is The Importance of Genetic Diversity. It is the 5th day of our 3rd unit. We've got the same objective that we had for the last 2 days of last week. Biologists will be able to explain the role of meiosis in sexual reproduction and genetic variation, but our essential question is different today. Why is it important that individuals of the same species have a certain amount of genetic diversity? Why is it important that they have genetic diversity? This is going to be an essential question to which we return throughout the course. Especially as we talk about natural selection and evolution, but we'll get a quick introduction to those concepts today. Okay. So we're going to quickly review before we begin this conversation about mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis, I like to think of it as standing for identical twins, the IT that stands for identical twins, because mitosis produces cells that are identical to one another, and they're also identical to the parent cell. All right, so they are genetically identical. They're exactly the same to one another, but also to the parent cell. Meiosis, on the other hand, I like to think of the E and the S in meiosis as standing for egg and sperm. Meiosis is the process that produces eggs and sperm cells. Egg cells, I should say, not eggs, but egg cells and sperm cells. And of course, egg cells and sperm cells are genetically unique. Every egg cell that is produced is different than every other egg cell. Every sperm cell that is produced is different than every other sperm cell. Okay. And then we also ran through this Venn diagram. I'm not going to go through it again, but I will show you the end of it. Please keep in mind that I did add something. This happens after interphase. I forgot to include that the last time, but both mitosis and meiosis can only happen after interphase. But you guys knew that already. So if you weren't here yesterday, please do not yesterday. If you weren't here Friday, please do make sure that you take a picture or a screenshot of this image, of this Venn diagram, and then reproduce it in your own notes. That's great practice. I want you guys to get in the habit of drawing these visual diagrams in your own notes. Okay, we're going to play a Quizizz to review as well. Please don't pay attention to the code that's on your screen. Look here, this is the correct code, 296212. Oops. Or you can click on the link that I'm sending to the chat now. Thank you, JT. Thank you, Araceli. Thanks, Tayshawn. Thank you, Josue. Thank you, Melissa and Dijon. Thank you, Abina. Okay, we've got 17 students in class today, and 12 of you are in the game. Let's make sure that we get these last 5 folks to join us, please. Okay, 10 more seconds to those of you who have not yet joined. I don't see Nico's name here. Who else do I not see? Deasia, Nico. Santuan. Siana. Let's get joined up, please. I'm going to start the game. You guys can join even after we start it. Okay, excellent. Let's keep going. We're starting off with a wonderful accuracy, 100%. Let's keep it going. Good, folks. I do want that accuracy to be up near 70, 75% if possible. Okay, we've got 7 people done. Araceli finishes with a victory so far, and it doesn't look like anybody's catching up, but our accuracy as a class is exactly where we want it to be. Looks like Janelle got every question right, but maybe you didn't answer as quickly as Araceli and Abigail, but excellent job, Janelle. Excellent job, Melissa and Lisa. Everybody in the top 5, great job. And I imagine that the rest of you who are still working are also doing quite well to have our accuracy at 75%. That's exactly where I want it to be, guys. That means we're in a great place headed into Wednesday's test. So the 4 of you who are still working, go ahead and finish up. Let's take 2 more minutes, 2 more minutes. Okay. So let's jump back into the slides. Those of you who are still working, you can continue working. It's no big deal. So we only have a few notes that I'd like to take today. Shouldn't take too long. We did define this phrase, genetic variation, last week, but I wanted to show it one more time because it is relevant again to our conversation today. So genetic variation is a measure of the variation that exists in the genetic makeup of individuals within a population. So as we can see, all of those sexually reproducing organisms on the screen, whether they be frogs or birds or um, gorillas, are those gorillas? Maybe orangutans, who knows? But also plant species, and then also fungi, which are not included here. They all reproduce sexually, which means that they all have a certain amount of genetic variation. There is no, there are no two human beings who are alike. There are no two individuals from a species of sexually reproducing organisms that are exactly alike. They're all different in some ways. So why is that difference important? Why is it important that there is genetic variation within a species? Why is that important? What do you all think?
You want us to answer the question?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. I think it's important. I think it's important why, because we don't want nobody else to be like us, because like it's only one person to be.
Okay, yeah. So we definitely want to think about the benefits of individuality in terms of our personalities. Yeah, that's important. And also in terms of our physical characteristics, we enjoy some difference and some uniqueness. Abigail, I'm sorry. Abigail says to recognize each other. That's so true. That's very scientific of you, actually, Abigail. Something that we'll talk a little bit about later when we talk about animal behavior. Um, Animals they are able to recognize each other, even though there are differences that exist. And so, based on these differences, we can even study this in very, very simple organisms that don't have very complicated nervous systems. We know that they're able to recognize family members versus members of their species who they are not directly related to. They can recognize mates, they can recognize children, and that's because of that genetic diversity. So there's a specific chemical sense that is associated with each individual, and that chemical sense is unique, and it allows other people to identify you. And then also, yeah, Dijon is kind of getting at a larger concept. We want genetic diversity amongst populations because that limits the amount of competition that is required. We don't have to compete for the same resources. We don't have to live on the same land. We don't have to compete for the same water. The possibility of a mutation with a favorable trait. And then Josue brings it back to natural selection, which is something that he talked a little bit about last week and something that we'll talk about right now. So genetic variation allows natural selection to pass on beneficial genes. Thank you for that segue, Josue. We pass on the beneficial genes, and then we start to diminish or get rid of the harmful genes. Genetic variation is advantageous because some individuals are able to adapt to their environment, which increases their chances of survival and reproduction. So please make sure that you're writing those points down. Okay, let's watch this video. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
The theory of evolution was condition number 1. Individuals within a population differ. There are features that differ within populations of the same animal. In our case, the feature that varies between our giraffes is neck length. Some giraffes were born with long necks, some were born with short necks. Condition number 2. The differences are, at least in part, passed from parents to offspring. Darwin's descent with modification is the idea that offspring are fairly similar to their parents with some genetic differences. Condition number 3. Some individuals are more successful at surviving and reproducing than others. In the case of our giraffes, the long neck individual did not acquire its neck by stretching to grab the leaves. Instead, individuals within the population were born with the neck length that was longer than others. Because the longer neck allowed them to reach the food that was otherwise unattainable, it gave them an advantage. Condition number 4. The successful individuals succeed because of variant traits they have inherited and will pass on to their offspring. Giraffes with the longer neck advantage are in better health and able to pass this feature to their offspring. Because this trait is more successful than shorter necks, more individuals in the population have it. Over time, this process can result in populations that specialize for particular environments and may eventually result in emergence of new species. In other words, natural selection is an important process, though not the only process, by which evolution takes place within a population of organisms. Let's review. Individuals within a population differ. The differences are, at least.
Okay. So individuals within a population differ. We all have differences just by nature of the fact that we were produced via sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is always going to lead to genetic variation. Some of those differences get passed on from parents to offspring. Some of them don't, but some of them do. Some of the differences also lead to a genetic advantage. So some individuals are more, quote unquote, successful at surviving and reproducing. And so it's more likely that those successful traits get passed on. It's more likely that the successful traits get passed on, and eventually we end up with those successful traits becoming more and more prevalent in the population. It might even lead to a totally new species. These are concepts we'll talk more about later in the course. But we have to acknowledge that genetic diversity is important. It gives us a greater chance at surviving. It gives us a greater chance at reproducing.
The theory.
All right. On Friday, we talked about 5 sources of genetic variation. Can you all help me remember what those 5 sources are? What was one of the 5 sources? Yeah, the first one, okay, we've got 3 now in the group, but I'm going to go with Janelle's first because that's what I have listed first. Mutations. Mutations are the most common source of genetic variation, so we list them first. We're going to talk about these mutations in greater depth later on in the course, but we did talk about a few types of mutations already. A mutation is just an error, essentially, in the genetic code. It could be when one of the bases gets deleted, or a base is inserted where it shouldn't be, or a group of bases is replaced. The second one, I think, let's see, who said it? Melissa, crossing over. So we can see crossing over in this pretty cool animation here. You can see some of the blue chromosome ends up on the red, and some of the red chromosome ends up on the blue. That's that process of crossing over as they exchange genetic material. This is what is the beginning of what makes those 4 gametes that are produced in meiosis. This is what actually makes them different. Because each of these strands of the X is going to end up in a different cell. So now you've got a totally blue strand. You've got a blue strand that has some red. You've got a red strand that has some blue. And you've got a totally red strand. They all end up in different cells. So this increases the amount of genetic variation. Then we talked about independent assortment, which Abigail just typed out. Independent assortment means it's totally random which gamete receives which genes. It's a totally random process. And because we've got all these different genes that are located on, in the case of humans, located on 23 chromosomes, 23 chromosome pairs, the different combinations of chromosomal alignments are huge. There's no guarantee that a cell is going to end up with a specific gene. It's just a random process. That's independent assortment. Number 4 is non-disjunction. That came from Abigail as well. Non-disjunction means that something went wrong in the process of meiosis that prevented the chromosomes from splitting or prevented the chromatids from splitting. And so you end up with a cell that has too much genetic information or too little genetic information. And then lastly, JT told us fertilization as well. Fertilization is, of course, a source of genetic variation because you've got 23 chromosomes coming from the father, 23 chromosomes coming from the mother, and those chromosomes carry similar genes, but not the same genes. Not the same alleles, I should say. They carry the same genes, but not the same alleles. So they both have the gene for hair color, but they might have different versions of that gene, which is called an allele. All right. Let's take a look at this.
This is how a human gets made. Every one of us started out this way. We've a pretty good idea what happens over the 9 months it takes to produce a newborn. But there's this one bit that's been missing. Right at the beginning, before this animation even starts. The very first few weeks. Now armed with new ways of growing human embryos in the lab, scientists are learning what the very beginning of human development looks like. For decades, studying this crucial early time in a human embryo's development was a technical headache. Embryos are hard to get and keep alive outside the body. And it's an ethical challenge. Guidelines put together in the late 70s and 80s prevent scientists from growing embryos for longer than 14 days. Despite the hurdles, scientists do know a bit about what happens in those critical weeks, often from animal studies or rare human tissue samples. They know that sperm fertilizes egg, and one cell grows to 2, 4, 8, and so on. Around day 5 or 6, the blob starts to feature different types of cell. Scientists call this blob a blastocyst. All being well, the cells in the blastocyst begin to differentiate. 1 week in, it implants into the wall of the uterus. What happens next has been a bit of a mystery. By implanting itself into the womb's wall, the embryo basically hides, and that makes studying it in humans impossible. One way of exploring this crucial time is to study embryos donated by people who no longer need them for fertility treatment. In the last few years, several labs have developed new ways to nurture these embryos. their techniques have allowed them to start building a picture of human development that's more detailed than ever before. Here's a day 6 embryo growing in a lab. Cells destined to become the actual fetus are tagged in green. Those that go on to form the placenta in blue. By day 8, the cells are sorting and arranging themselves. The green fetal cells have condensed together, and in red here are cells that will form the interface between the baby and the placenta. It seems these extra embryonic structures develop a little later in humans than expected from studies in other animals. Day 10. The whole thing increases in size, and bundles of cells start developing into support structures. Surprisingly, at this stage, the embryo can direct its own development with no input from the mother's tissues. By day 12, the outskirts of the embryo are preparing to bind more strongly to the wall of the uterus. After all, if this were a natural pregnancy, the embryo would be there for the next 9 months. You can even see little holes appearing, ready for the mother's blood vessels to start supplying the embryo with essential oxygen and nutrients. By now, the embryo is signaling its presence to the mother via a hormone, the one that pregnancy tests pick up, HCG, labelled here in yellow. After 2 weeks, the teams ended their experiments in line with the ethical 14-day limit. To study what happens after 14 days, researchers had to turn to different techniques. Recently, scientists have built artificial embryo-like structures from stem cells. Using these partial models, they can study things like cell signaling, or even the formation of the primitive streak, the crucial thread of cells which guides a process called gastrulation. That's the moment the embryo decides which end will become the head. Here they use human stem cells growing in an animal embryo to explore that process. But even after this early phase is over, there is still a lot of work involved in building a body. To study later phases, scientists have made and analysed high-resolution 3D atlases of human embryos and fetuses. One team found that the left and right hands don't simply mirror each other when growing their nerves. Instead, some branches take random paths in each limb. Another group saw muscles that grew in early embryos only to disappear as the fetus developed, like these. As yet, they're not sure why. It's becoming ever clearer just how important a human embryo's first few weeks are. Many scientists hope that more research will lead to a better grasp of why some pregnancies fail and how birth defects arise, maybe even make in vitro fertilization work better. But some just want to understand exactly what happens to this tiny ball of cells in this short spark of time at the beginning of all of us.
Okay, any thoughts about that video? Anything interesting? I imagine you learned something there. Okay. So yeah, it's a unique process. It really is a miracle. I know that's cliche to say, but the process of a human being being born from the time it begins as a zygote, a single cell, is a very, very complicated process that is susceptible to a lot of different mistakes. So for a healthy human child to be born on time is something that is really quite remarkable. And I see Dejan, it was interesting seeing how the cells actually duplicated. Yeah. And that's a process that we've talked about called mitosis. So remember, meiosis is only needed to produce sperm and egg cells. Every other time that the cell is dividing, it's undergoing mitosis. And this lines out exactly what happens. So, of course, adult males are able to produce sperm throughout their entire lifetimes, but adult or females are born with a set number of egg cells. They will have already produced, they will have already gone through meiosis a set number of times, and they have a set number of cells. Keep this in mind, because what it means is that once a female is born, she will never undergo, that female will never undergo meiosis again. They're already done. They already have made their set number of egg cells. So the sperm and the egg unite through the process of fertilization, and what is called a zygote is created. A zygote is that original cell that is made as a result of that unity. And until about week 4, that zygote is basically just dividing. It's not really becoming anything specifically, it's just dividing and creating more cells. These cells are what we refer to as pluripotent cells, otherwise known as stem cells, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. These stem cells don't really have a decided purpose yet. We call them pluripotent because pluri means multiple and potent means powers. So these cells have multiple powers. They might become nerve cells, they might become skeletal cells, they might become muscle cells. Their job has not yet been determined. So for those first 4 weeks, it's just a cell that is dividing, and it's not really becoming any specific type of cell just yet. Once we reach week 5, now this process of becoming specific has begun. It's a process called cell specification. Based on the location of the cells, the body will start to decide what their job should be. We saw that process, or they mentioned that process, in which you end up with what's called the primitive streak, and this streak basically determines which end of these growing cells will end up becoming the head, and which end will end up becoming the bottom of the spinal cord. Then, based on that orientation, everything else orients itself as well. And so for those for between weeks 5 and 9, the essential organs are developing. The brain, the spinal cord, the lungs, the heart. They don't develop to the point where an embryo could successfully live on its own, without its mother, outside of its mother, outside of the womb. But they do develop to the point where this embryo is now getting oxygen from an umbilical cord. It's starting to have its own system of blood circulation. And by week 9, there are some very basic nerve functions happening as well, meaning that what will eventually become the brain is now starting to control the breathing, is now starting to control the pumping of a heart. Still very, very primitive. It's not until really week 10 and for the next 30 weeks after that, that those essential organs are becoming more sophisticated. Additional structures like the skeletal system and the muscular system are starting to develop as well, the digestive system. And at this point as well, the developing human's sex will also be determined. Of course, that's predetermined based on the genetic makeup of the sperm and the egg cells, but now we'll actually be able to determine, looking at imaging, what the sex of the child is. And so that development continues until about 40 weeks. Now, 40 weeks is actually 10 months, right? I think we typically hear that the gestation period of human beings is 9 months, but really when all is said and done, if everything goes well, it should be closer to 40 weeks, which is 10 months. And then, of course, you get a baby. So the only time that an organism is going through meiosis is to produce sperm and egg cells. And only sperm and egg cells are haploids. Everything else is a diploid. Here's that cycle. The gametes, the sperm and the egg cell, they unite in this process of fertilization to create a zygote. That zygote will undergo cell specialization to decide what jobs those cells will end up having. Eventually, it becomes an embryo, and through mitosis, it continues to grow and develop. Eventually, that will become a full-grown organism or an adult. That organism will have, in the case of female organisms, it will already have undergone meiosis to create eggs. And in the case of male organisms, it will engage in an ongoing process of meiosis to create sperm cells, and then it starts again. So I do encourage you all to write down this human life cycle. This is another visual representation that you can take notes about and connect it to other concepts. Okay. Here's another view of it. I'll come back to that, but we only have a couple minutes. There is an exit ticket and there is an assignment. This will be a formal point opportunity, U3D5. It's the Unit 2 exam most missed questions. So it's 20 questions, 10 of them are multiple choice, 10 of them are free response. The 10 multiple choice questions are the questions that were missed with the most frequency on the Unit 2 test. So these are the questions that we struggled the most with. So I want you guys to go, answer those questions, and each of them has a corresponding free response question for you to further explain how you arrived at the answer. Okay, so that exit ticket, you should probably be able to just knock that out. But I did go ahead and extend the deadline for this Unit 2 exam MMQs until Friday. So you have all week to do it, even though our test is on Wednesday. These other assignments will be due on Wednesday. Any questions?
Where is the Unit 2 exam missed questions at?
It's in the Unit 3 module. It's under U3D5. So yeah, I can just share this tab. Unit 3 module, scroll down to Unit 3 Day 5, and it should be right there. Yes, the exam will be this Wednesday, so all of your assignments will be this Wednesday, February 10th. Okay, it's 1:20, so go ahead and knock out that exit ticket, I'm sorry, before you get ready for your other class. It's just 4 questions. It should be pretty easy. Other than that, I will talk to you all tomorrow, and I hope you have a great Monday.